It appears that being stigmatized and shunned by Europe, with allies explicitly refusing to grant the United States right of way to strike Iran, has left Washington and President Donald Trump in a state of visible malcontent, seemingly oblivious to the changing tides of the current situation. Despite the diplomatic cold shoulder, the US has made the provocative decision to deploy B-52 Stratofortress strategic bombers directly into Iranian sovereign airspace. This move seemingly ignores intelligence warnings that Tehran's integrated air defense networks remain largely intact and functional. It remains to be seen whether Trump can truly master this high-stakes game, or if he is inadvertently providing the Iranian people with a fresh supply of raw materials to forge new pots and pans from the wreckage of downed American giants. Speaking from the Pentagon on March 31, 2026, US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth asserted that increasing American air superiority has reached a threshold allowing for B-52 sorties over mainland Iran. This is being framed by the administration as a definitive signal that Tehran's defensive shield has been significantly degraded. Hegseth's confidence suggests a White House convinced that the preliminary phases of shock and awe have cleared the path for heavy strategic bombardment, effectively neutralizing the threat of surface-to-air missile SAM batteries. The deployment of the B-52 carries a heavy symbolic and tactical weight. These aircraft are massive, subsonic, and possess a radar cross-section the size of a flying apartment complex. Unlike the stealthy B-2 Spirit or the B-21 Raider, the B-52 is inherently vulnerable to modern air defense systems. It relies entirely on the assumption that the sky has been cleared of all threats before it enters the fray. It is a brute force weapon of a bygone era, now being tested against 21st century asymmetric defenses. Consequently, the decision to fly B-52s directly over Iran serves as Washington's ultimate proof of concept regarding its belief that the enemy's air defenses are blind. By parading these vulnerable giants through Iranian skies, Washington is broadcasting a message of total dominance. However, even Hegseth had to offer a sober caveat. Tehran still possesses the asymmetric reach to retaliate via long-range missiles and kamikaze drones against US assets and allied nations across the wider region. The sky eye may be watching, but the ground beneath still holds dangerous secrets. Prior to this escalation, the US found itself in a state of unprecedented diplomatic isolation within the Western fold. Spanish Defense Minister Margarita Robles officially confirmed that Madrid has denied authorization for any US military aircraft involved in the Iranian theater to traverse Spanish airspace. Robles went as far as to use remarkably blunt and severe language, characterizing the US-Israeli coalition's campaign as profoundly illegal and unjust. This is not just a policy disagreement, it is a moral and legal condemnation from a core NATO ally. This blockade has forced US flight wings, including those departing from critical hubs in the UK and across Central Europe, to execute tortuous, zigzag flight paths. These detours are incredibly costly, draining millions in extra fuel and adding hours of fatigue to air crews. Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez issued a stern warning, stating that one cannot respond to an illegal act with another illegal act, as such a cycle provides the spark for humanity's greatest catastrophes. Spain's resolve is absolute. They have effectively padlocked the strategic military bases of Rota and Morón de la Frontera, which historically served as the vital gas stations and logistical lifelines for American expeditionary campaigns in the East. Spain's resistance appears to have triggered a domino effect across the Mediterranean. Italy, another traditionally staunch ally, has begun erecting its own bureaucratic hurdles. While not a total no-fly ban, Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni's government has refused to allow American heavy bombers to land or refuel at the Sigonella base in Sicily. The Italian defense minister's reasoning was masterfully subtle, claiming these are not routine logistical flights but active combat sorties which necessitate a lengthy and uncertain parliamentary approval process. In reality, this is a clever stalling tactic designed to keep Italy from being dragged into the gravitational pull of a conflict they did not sign up for. Even Switzerland, a nation whose very identity is rooted in neutrality, has issued a firm no to US requests for transit rights to attack Iran. This paints a heartbreaking picture for Washington. When the cannons roar in Iran, the old friends in Europe are no longer willing to share the fire. They are paralyzed by concerns over international law, economic fallout, and the unpredictable, gut-driven leadership style of Donald Trump. Reacting to this betrayal, President Trump took to Truth Social to unleash a torrent of vitriol, labeling NATO a one-way street where the US pours hundreds of billions into defense only to be abandoned in its hour of need. He even threatened to sever trade ties with Spain and told Europeans they could go and seize the strait themselves if they wanted their oil. Trump's narrative is clear. The US will no longer act as the big brother who bears every burden if allies refuse to contribute. He boldly asserted that the US is the most powerful nation in human history and has never needed the help of NATO, Japan, or South Korea to secure victory. However, keen observers have noted a farcical contradiction here. Only weeks ago, Trump was aggressively lobbying these same nations to join a coalition of the willing to protect the Strait of Hormuz. When met with rejection, he immediately pivoted 180 degrees to claim he never wanted their help in the first place, a classic move to save face in the wake of a diplomatic snub. The loss of access to logistical crown jewels in Germany, the UK, and Spain has made the US power projection in the Middle East more fragile than ever. The lack of overflight rights doesn't just prolong the mission, it causes operational costs to skyrocket at a time when global energy prices are in a state of high alarm. The late February incident, where 15 American KC-135 tankers were forced to flee from Spain to France and Germany, serves as a vivid illustration of Washington being isolated within its own alliance. Trump's push to hike NATO defense spending to 5% of GDP, coupled with threats of abandonment, is pushing the transatlantic relationship into a profound crisis of trust. Looking at these developments, it is difficult not to find the contradictions in Trump's rhetoric over the last fortnight somewhat comical. On one hand, Washington was frantically calling for a united front with NATO, Japan, South Korea, and Australia to secure global energy flows. Yet, the moment Madrid, Rome, and Berlin shook their heads, Trump's attitude underwent a total metamorphosis on social media. He suddenly became the Lone Ranger, declaring that the world's strongest nation no longer desires the interference of NATO. This behavior signals a deep strategic disorientation. When the world doesn't follow his script, he minimizes the role of the actors to preserve his own ego. In truth, Trump's insistence that the military campaign has been such a resounding success that he no longer needs help is likely a euphemism for total diplomatic isolation. The refusal of allies to grant base or airspace access has dealt a heavy blow to US logistical sustainability, forcing the White House to shoulder the astronomical costs of this war entirely on its own. It is a collision between Trump's personal intuition and the cold, hard reality of geopolitics, where even a superpower finds that it cannot solve every problem as a solitary hunter without real companions. Europe is desperate for President Trump to bring the war in Iran to a swift conclusion. Conversely, Trump wants Europe to help him apply the very pressure needed to force that ending. According to experts, Europe has a long list of reasons, both public and private, to keep saying no. Chief among these is the fact that the US and Israel launched these strikes without any meaningful prior consultation with their allies. Unlike previous coalitions of the willing, Washington failed to build a broad international consensus or establish a clear legal framework before the first bombs fell. In the initial phase, US requests were relatively modest, focusing on the use of existing European bases for logistics. However, as the conflict escalated and Iran retaliated by choking the Strait of Hormuz, Washington began demanding more direct skin in the game from its allies. The response has been a wall of hesitation. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, the successor to Olaf Scholz, has been firm, asserting that Berlin has no obligation to join a war it was not consulted on from the start. This reflects a broader European sentiment that they will not be treated as vassal states in an impulsive military adventure. President Trump has frequently invoked the NATO Charter to shame his allies into compliance. However, European leaders are pushing back, reminding Washington that NATO is a defensive alliance, not a tool for preemptive strikes. Article 5, the principle of collective defense, only applies when a member is attacked on their own soil. In the current context, many European leaders argue that this threshold has simply not been met. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte has consistently maintained that while individual members may provide varying levels of support, the alliance as a whole is not a direct party to the conflict, a distinction that has infuriated the Trump administration. On the Iranian side, President Masoud Pezeshkian has been anything but polite, warning of a staggering price for any external intervention. He has been quick to point out the perceived hypocrisy of the EU, which remains silent on what he calls the coalition's flagrant violations of international law. Iran is effectively using Europe's internal divisions as a shield, betting that the West's lack of unity will eventually force Washington to the negotiating table. Tehran knows that as long as the US remains diplomatically isolated, the clock is ticking against Trump's domestic popularity. Meanwhile, President Trump appears to be looking for an honorable exit, claiming the campaign could wrap up in the next 2 to 3 weeks. He is skillfully attempting to pass the hot potato of protecting the Strait of Hormuz to the nations that are most dependent on its oil. However, seasoned observers recognize this as a risky hit-and-run strategy. The pressure on the American taxpayer, with gas prices surging past $4 per gallon, coupled with the cold shoulder from NATO, is forcing the White House to find a way to de-escalate. The slight dip in Brent crude prices, following signals of Tehran's willingness to talk, shows a world starved for peace, even if the conditions Iran brings to the table are likely to be very bitter pills for Washington to swallow.